Prep test 33, game number 2. It's the classic birds in the forest game. This game really tests conditionality in and out. It's an older game. It's from December 2000, but it's a classic, and they've repeated it many, many times over the years. Anyone watched Legally Blonde here? Yeah, so you know that the CDs game that they referenced at one point with like the used and new, jazz, opera, pop, rap, and soul. So that game is like a harder version of this Birds in the Forest game. But this game was in test 31. It was test 45 with the photographs game, test 58 with the volunteers. It's come up again and again and again over time. And so this is a classic that I think is really valuable to use for illustrative purposes here to deal with conditionality, contrapositives, and linking conditional statements together. So if any of you are using any textbooks like the Logic Games Bible, they have it as an example in there, and so you may have access to it in some way. But again, Prep Test 33, Logic Game number 2, Birds in the Forest. The variables are G, H, J, M, S, W. And I have the rules written here just so I can walk through creating the main diagram and linking things together, and then you can go home and try the game on your own if you like. So these are the variables. We have them, there are 6 birds, and some are in the forest, some are not. So we're selecting, we're choosing. Some are in, some are out. That's what makes this an in-out or grouping conditional game. The first rule tells us if harriers are in, then grosbeaks are not. That's the first rule of the game. Now, people will typically take all the conditional rules and their contrapositives and later try to link everything together. This becomes really messy, so I recommend avoiding it. It's much more efficient to link things together as you go, step by step. So first, H arrow not G, contrapositive, G arrow not H. But I'm not going to keep taking each rule and doing this again and again. I'm going to build them onto what I already have here. So the next rule says J, M, or both are in. If J, M, or both are in, then H will also be in. Now, we already have H here, so we can simply take J and M and stick them onto the front of this. If J or M is in, then H is in. Now, the rule says if J, M, or both is in, then H. So you might ask, well, what do we do about the or both? And my answer is the or both is redundant. You don't need to worry about it because in logic, the word or already includes the possibility of both. So this is all you have to do. You don't even have to write the word or here because J alone is sufficient to require H and M alone is also sufficient to require H. So you could just leave it like this. But then we have to think to ourselves, well, what about the contrapositive? People get a little confused here. And my recommendation is just treat them separately. J requires H also. M happens to require H. Once you have that, you could say, well, J requires H. Anybody, the contrapositive? What would be the contrapositive of this statement alone? Perfect. Not H, then not J. We have not H here. We can stick a not J on after it. And then M requires H, same thing. Not H requires not M. So we tack that on to the bottom here. I wouldn't actually write that part down on the side. That's just for illustrative purposes now. On test day, I want you to be proficient enough in the contrapositive where you can link it on right here. And you'll see these are kind of mirror images of each other. J is positive at the beginning here. It becomes negative at the end there. M is positive at the beginning here. It's negative at the end there. G is negative at the end here. Becomes positive at the beginning here. So that's pretty much the layout of the first 2 rules. You see they link together pretty nicely. Now the third rule says W requires G. We've got G right here. We can simply stick a W on in front of that. It kind of feels weird to build onto the beginning of something, but logically, it's no different than tacking onto the end of it. So we have W requires G, contrapositive, not G, requires not W. So we're starting to build some major inferences here. We can see that at a glance now, W indirectly requires not M, and J indirectly requires not W. the fact that these are not adjacent, they are spaced apart with other things in between, has no bearing on the logic. But LSAC will reward us for having made these connections, because it is kind of impressive to be able to do this, not to toot my own horn here, but from LSAC's perspective, making these chains requires taking contrapositives and linking things together, and that's what they're looking for you to do on games, at least in this kind of game. Now, the final rule says not J requires S. We have not J here. We stick S onto the end of it. Contrapositive of this, so that's not J requires S. We flip the order, so S was at the end, now it's at the beginning. It was positive there, now it's negative. J was negative, now it's positive. We have positive J here, positive J up there. We stick a negative S onto the front of that. And again, just doing that for illustration. So now you see it got even longer. It got even a little more complicated, but that's just the nature of the game. Now we can see that W indirectly requires S, and of course not S requires not W. So it's a lot, but this is the game. If you have these two diagrams, you've pretty much got the game made. It's pretty much wrapped up in a bag. But there are a couple of confusing things about a game like this that I think are worth talking about. One of them is that we have positive variables followed by negative variables, and we also have negative variables followed by positive variables. And these are very different things. A positive followed by a negative means at least one of the two will always be out. They conflict. So you could never have both H and G in at the same time. That might seem kind of obvious, and this is the easier part. There's a harder part coming. But if we have H requires not G, that means at least one out, maybe both will be out. You cannot have both in. I know this is all really obvious, but it gets harder when we look at the other kind. So the example of this is H and G. So my real world example for this is if you have cookies, then you can't have donuts. It's intuitive that you can't have too many desserts or you'll get sick or something like that. At least that's what they tell me. So that's one type of relationship. Now, the other type of relationship that is more confusing is when you have a negative followed by a positive. So that is our not J, then S, and of course there are more examples than just that. Not H, then S is also a negative arrow positive, but this means something very different. This means at least one in. So you can never lack both. You must always have at least one of the two. And maybe you could have both in. That's the weirdest part of this, is that you see a negative and a positive side by side. People will often assume that means that there is a conflict. But there is not a conflict here. There's nothing stopping you from having both. If I told you, if S, what else must be true? There is nothing at all that we can infer about this. Nothing else logically follows. It's totally open-ended. So it is in fact possible to have all of, let's say, M, H, J, S. Those four could all be in. Nothing at all prevents that. Obviously, there are conflicts with G and W about that, but these four together is perfectly fine. There's actually a question related to that. So the only big takeaway from this one is that you cannot lack both. And my example for this is that if you don't eat your peas, then you must eat your carrots. So if you don't have one vegetable, then you must have the other, but no one's going to stop you from eating lots of vegetables, right? So those are the two kinds of relationships you really want to be on the lookout for in this kind of game, and they've tested this again and again and again over the years. If you want more examples, again, test 31 game 2, test 45 game 3, and test 58 game 2. Maybe I'll write that down for all of you. Yeah. So those are, and there's also actually one more, test 36, game 1. So it's happened again and again and again over time. I have a list on my website of 7 logic games that repeated, and this is the first category. And I actually wrote my own logic game that is in the same style. It's not a carbon copy, it has its own logic to it, but my own logic game I also, where people vote for and against bills, political bills. And this is an example of that with lots of conditional chains. Has anybody done this game before? How'd you find it? Yeah, you get used to it. That's the thing. I think the repetition is really important, because obviously seeing things like this for the first time, it's going to take a long time. You're not going to do it in 8 minutes and 45 seconds at the outset. But if you've done 5 of them or 6 of them, then when you see a new one on test day, you could breeze through the whole game in maybe 6 minutes ideally, and then have a time bank build up to do tougher games later. So that's pretty much, I think this is one of the most valuable games to learn overall on the LSAT period. There's obviously ordering, there's grouping, there's combinations, there's relative ordering, but I think that this kind of conditional logic, the contrapositive and chaining things together, it's a concept that comes up not only in games but also in logical reasoning a little bit too. So you really do get a big return on your time investment for learning this.